Hello there, I'm David Bradley, aka Schizophreniforms, and this is a Black Book video regarding my idea that, regardless of whether schizophrenia is a malfunction of the brain or not, or an aberrant process, that it may have been selected for by natural selection throughout our species due to having certain beneficial attributes, and that there will be a follow-up video after this on the White Book explaining what I think the meaning behind those things are. So let's jump into the text. So this is chapter 4 of article 1 of the Black Book, and it's entitled The Necessary Delusions of the Sane. I'm just going to read through it and then I'll kind of summarise at the end, so here we go. Essentially, humans have evolved with two specialist tendencies, both of which are oriented around survival. The first is a limited, specialised range of perceptions, and the second is emphasis on trauma and avoiding violence and harm in memory. The latter we shall discuss first. The nature of the mind is such that it repeatedly re-experiences trauma through memory. We are designed to live through evolutionary forces to survive based on our sensitivity towards trauma. Those of us who weren't paranoid wouldn't check that last time for a predator, which is as much as to say heightened agitation and paranoia are an evolutionary advantage to the survival of our species, at least historically speaking. This is not to say that the socially cohesive propensities haven't been equally essential. And in fact, the virtue of humanity I admire the most is our tendency towards compassion and organisation. However, it's still apparent that the traits associated with psychosis, which are often triggered by trauma or violence in childhood, such as heightened states of awareness, social sensitivity and distorted perceptions of behaviour oriented around fear of attack, whether perceived or real, a profound tendency towards unified ideas that unite as one congruent narrative, like grand correlations and pattern detection in events, regardless of their accuracy, in the form of delusions of grandeur and pseudo-synchronistic structures in the mind, that would enable survival due to the overwhelming state of hypervigilance and heightened sensory data streams from the unconscious mind. It would seem logical that these traits that are thought to be a potential state in anyone who has the triggering events or traumas combined with the genetic predisposition, although as far as I'm aware the science isn't fully clear on this yet, could have been a benefit to our ancestors, and that whilst the mechanisms of the state called psychosis are not fully understood, it is reasonable to believe that they are not simply a malfunction of the brain, but a part of human evolution that has enabled survival, and thus the genetic and epigenetic tendencies towards psychosis have not been eradicated through natural selection, but selected for and maintained by it. There's also to be considered the idea that this ability might have been socially desirable in a few regards, including that A, those who were supervigilant protected those who were not because of their paranoia, and B, the accompanying hallucinations and heightened senses may have appeared supernatural in origin. The former makes for keen warriors, hunters and protectors of social groups, and the ability to sense movement of prey or rival tribes more keenly, and is desirable and gives power and social status. The latter, however, gives a tactical advantage in terms of the unseen, and the ability to compel and persuade others through having a form of knowledge the rest of the group may not possess. It says here, which I'll discuss further in Article 3, so I'll just briefly describe that. Article 3 basically, it says here, it compares shamanic ability and other mystical traditions and practices to the experience of psychosis or schizophrenia, both the commonalities and the distinctions. So it could be suggested from this perspective, so I'll continue on. It could be suggested from this perspective that not only would survival be more likely from a natural selection or evolutionary standpoint, but also that through selective breeding and status-oriented desirability for the functions of the aforementioned cohesive standpoint, which is as much to say that socially it would be a benefit, and in terms of survival it would be a benefit, and therefore that justifies to me why it hasn't been eradicated and may have been selected for. By natural selection anyway. In regards to the second point, that humanity's perception of reality is necessarily inaccurate, and it says to cite a study. I might try and find a video linking it, but this was a study I read an article about, so I didn't read the original study. obviously, that I read at the article. And a study was done determining the relationship between accuracy of perception and survival. The results of this study strongly indicated that not only was accuracy of perception not beneficial for survival, but that it was in fact detrimental towards a creature's survival. And it says to elaborate more on the study as necessary. Basically, they did. They made these scientists. I don't know anything more than that off the top of my head. Made a digital model based on cognitive modelling techniques and digitally simulated these different potential traits: accuracy of perception versus specialised perception and survival instincts. And the creatures that had specialised perception did incredibly well because their survival-oriented specialist skills were honed for, whereas those with more accurate perceptions of the environment and all that sort of thing, it had a negative effect on their survival. So humans, for example, see a broad range of colours required to distinguish differences in plants, whereas true carnivorous animals see less colour and have a greater sense of smell. This further suggests that our perceptions are not only not true depictions of reality, but that we have perceptions oriented towards the needs we have, which is as much as to say that we only perceive that which our prehistory and our ancestry required us to perceive. This would seem to be a bit in conflict to a certain degree with the argument that psychosis heightens perception. However, an enhanced sensory range and a greater emotional sensitivity would, it seems, give a kind of extra sensory advantage as discussed above, but also that this greater sensory range would allow new knowledge that about the world at large that would, whether real or not, give an overwhelming sense of power and control, as well as to pre-literate superstitious societies as a sense of either divine or indeed demonic power, to which people would gravitate in order to annex and utilise their ability. There is, of course, especially in the current social constructs of the world, potential for the equal and exact opposite process to take place. The abandonment of supernatural or superstitious belief systems throughout the Renaissance and Enlightenment era, as well as the religious dominance of Christianity through relatively recent history, are both uprooted belief in the supernatural and demonized magic powers respectively. Then, with the foundations of modern psychology and its attempts to cure these abilities or perceptions, usually through damaging the brain, electroshock therapy, lobotomy, and indeed antipsychotics, which, as far as I know, are the primary treatment for psychotic symptoms, were originally designed and sometimes still used as a form of chemical lobotomy, or imprisonment and bizarre forms of torture and experimentation. And it's aimed to cite an article talking about the variety of bizarre and inhumane ways in which people with psychotic symptoms have been basically experimented on to try and fix them over the last 50 to 100 years, so that's just a side point to that. The perceivers of these alternate perceptions are now locked up, tortured, marginalised, downtrodden, abused, ostracised and outcast from society without any respect or support for the things that were once of extreme value to the community. And again, it's saying to cite the homelessness statistics, imprisonment, sectioning, and all these kind of... when I was originally writing it, I was thinking in terms of how we treat these people with these alternate perceptions of reality in general day-to-day. So I'll be back with a bit of a summary. So the basic gist of this chapter in this section of this chapter is to elucidate the idea that I have that more or less we are conditioned through misapprehension. And I made a previous video, which is the following section of this chapter, that talks about the impossibility of clear-headed explanation when you're in what is ultimately an altered state of consciousness, and the relationship between religious metaphor, profound disorder and confusion and inaccuracy of information and so on and so forth that comes back from these psychotic depending how you look at it, experiences. But as this is a Black Book video, I'm framing it in a certain way for a certain reason. And my feeling is very much that whether or not these symptoms are a result of brain damage, and I actually know, I can't cite it, but I do know there are studies being done that indicate now that there is very little difference between someone who's experienced being abused in childhood, or violence in childhood, or trauma in childhood, and a schizophrenic person, in terms of purely in terms of the damage done to certain areas of the brain because of that trauma. So it can manifest without hallucinations and delusions and altered perceptions of reality, but the damaged areas of the brain cross-correlate massively. So that's just something I thought was worth mentioning. It's because you have to have a genetic, like the lineage, basically. You have to have the lineage of these altered states of perceptions and those traumatic events. And so that is so often the case with people, as far as I'm, with the limited frame of what I'm aware of that information. And I'm simply saying that, or presenting the idea that not only were these things beneficial to survival, but they might have been socially cohesive tools. And if you look at tribal cultures, and this will be discussed later on in the book as well, probably quite extensively, but if you look at the way people interpret voice hearing, seeing alternate realities, seeing the dead, communicating with spirits, all these kind of phenomenologically hallucinatory psychotic symptoms, if you look at the way they're dealt with in other cultures, you can see that any attempt to, or you can see that basically they cross-correlate with things like shamanism, and that if given a healthy framework of understanding, as I've been trying to do, and part of the whole point of this is for me to integrate these experiences, that if you can navigate the trauma and heal it, that given the right support, given the right integrated thought, given the right framework, that these things can continue to be beneficial to society. They're not simply just a broken brain, like, and there are elements where I this is a black book video, so I'm going to say what I think, not what I feel necessarily, but there are elements where these symptoms are caused by a damaged brain. That's ultimately what it is. Like, certain areas of the whole cerebellum become damaged. I don't know what they are, because off the top of my head, but I could possibly do further research into that and come back and make another video about it. But there is strong indication that trauma damages the brain, which triggers these latent sensors, latent cognitive processes. And that if you can heal the trauma, then there's every reason to believe that these things could be beneficial in some way if they're dealt with appropriately and with support and acknowledgement. And again, as this is a black book video, I will heavily emphasize that treating it the way it's treated as a mental health issue enables people to survive, and that's enormously beneficial. So I don't have any problem with antipsychotics. I don't have any problem with traditional forms of therapy and psychotherapy and other treatment methods. I'm not poo-pooing that. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. What I am saying is that once you've dealt with the trauma and all the things that traditional psychotherapy can do, that the next phase of integration is learning to accept the experience. And the way I believe, as we'll talk about later on in the book, the way I believe that you can integrate these things is to, reframe them in a format that basically healthily influences the navigation of them. And it's my experience that the more I healthily reframe my hallucinations, the actually less persecutory they become, but that's just my experience. If you're saying something's a demon or the devil or evil or inherently nasty or just that it's this bleak, terrifying thing, and you're not able to open into an authoritative, confident dialogue with that creature because you're afraid of it, and you've demonized it and you don't know what it is, the ultimately fear and trauma has driven you to malappropriate certain experiences, and that maybe they can be healed by actually healing the trauma itself. So that's just kind of the rough explanation of my theory, but this will be discussed in more depth. And I'm not saying that medication is a bad thing. I'm not saying that Western psychology and Western medicine is a bad thing. Like, I wouldn't be here without it. And keep taking the meds if they're working for you, and if not, talk to your doctor about it. You know, because ultimately I'm here rationally talking to you because of those medications. I'm here sane and not dead because of those medications, and that's an important emphasis to make as well. I believe personally that the integration of both perspectives is ultimately the way to start healing. So I've been David Bradley, aka Schizophreniforms. If you like what you see, please click the like button. Subscribe if you want to see more. Maybe share this video with someone that it might be relevant to, or that might be interested in it, or on social media, or wherever you feel like it. And yeah, I hope this has been, at the very least, interesting. So I've been David Bradley. Thank you. Goodbye.